So our keynote speaker this morning is Tracey Baptiste, and we are thrilled to have Tracey with us. Tracey grew up in the Caribbean island of Trinidad. Growing up, she loved folk and fairy tales, both the folk tales of her native Trinidad and the European folk stories. She knew she wanted to be a writer from the time she was 3 when she read the Grimm's fairy tales and determined that someday she was going to write a book like that. Tracey's first novel, Angel's Grace, is a coming-of-age story of a teen on a search for her identity after discovering family secrets while spending the summer visiting her grandmother in Trinidad. Angel's Grace was named one of the 100 best books for reading and sharing by New York City librarians. Her newest book, The Jumbies, is a deliciously creepy middle-grade fantasy horror based on Caribbean folktales. The Jumbies, like the European fairy folk, are other, the supernatural, sometimes dangerous beings who live just out of sight. The Jumbies is rich with atmosphere, the sights, sounds, smells, and tastes of the Caribbean. When Corinne bites into an orange and the juice runs down her face, I could taste it so clearly it left me craving oranges. Tracey is also the author of 7 nonfiction books. I stole this from the website.
That's fine. I should update it because it's actually 9.
Oh, 9.
That's what the spaces are for.
She has worked for Scholastic Pearson and McGraw-Hill, editing reading and language arts textbooks. She is a former teacher with a master's in elementary education. Tracey is available for school and library visits. Oh wait, I missed this picture. Tracey is available for school and library visits. Her presentations offered include Jumbie defense classes. Now that's a class I want. Build a story for grades K and up, and The Plot Thickens, a writing workshop for grades 3 and up. She also offers Fairy God Author, manuscript consulting and editing services for writers. And so now, let me introduce the main event, Tracey.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I want to thank Sheila and Paula for inviting me. Sheila actually ran up to me at the Gaithersburg Book Festival, right? Is that where it was? I was just like, oh, you gotta come to Kidlitcon. And I'm like, I've never heard of Kidlitcon. And she described it, and I was just like, yes! All right, so wait, hold on. Let me put this down so that I don't mess up my. Okay, here we go. So I was invited to speak to you all today because of this book. This creepy, weird Trinidadian storybook. For the last few months, I've been dubbed a horror writer for children, and I've had to apologize to friends whose children have started to crawl back into bed with them at night. Oops. But I have a confession. When I was writing The Jumbies, in all the years it took me to put this story together, it never occurred to me that it was horror. I mean, a story about a wicked jumbie that follows a girl out of the forest, tries to drown her friends in a river, turns her father into a snarling, mindless drone. How is that horror? The first time it was brought to my attention that this story was horror was when my agent sent me an email with her pitch notes for The Jumbies, and in it were the words, touches of horror. I literally stopped at that part of the email, and I thought, touches of what now? Because this whole time I thought I was writing a fairy tale, and a pretty standard fairy tale at that, with a brave young protagonist, and a foul-tempered witch, and a creature bent on acquiring power. It's like every fairy tale ever, right? Somehow in all the years that I have loved fairy tales, I never really thought about the scare factor. I love the adventure, and the bravery, and the twists, and I admit, I liked the romance. But the scary stuff, it didn't seem so scary because I had Jumbies. Jumbies are malevolent creatures in Caribbean folktales. Hold on. It's not good. It's happening. It's not going to the next picture.
It's,
Oh, you said, oh, sorry, now we have an issue.
Technical
there you
difficulties.
go.
Okay,
So
there
just
we go. Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna sit over here.
Still
And, right, no. Alright. So, Jumbies are malevolent creatures in Caribbean folktales, and there is the Supina, where she sheds her skin at night and bursts into flame and flies around looking for someone so she can suck their blood. The scariest thing, though, about the Supina is that during the day, she looks like a grandma. A grandma maybe like your own grandma. I happen to have a grandma who was very ornery. She was pretty scary during the day. So maybe it's not so surprising that one of the many times that I stayed over at my grandmother's house, I crawled into her bedroom at night to make sure that her skin was on her body. This did not make my ornery grandma very happy. I will not tell you what happened next. This pretty lady, or any pretty lady that one of my uncles was dating might be a magic less. This kind of jumbie are always beautiful, well-dressed ladies. If you've ever been to Trinidad or ever met a Trinidadian woman, you know that the women there dress like they're going to be on camera, even if they're just going on a grocery run. Now, so we just have like a little discussion about my shoes. Okay, so here are my shoes. So sidebar, day before yesterday, when I was packing for this trip, I was on the phone with my mother, who's in Trinidad. And so she asked me what I had packed, and so I was telling her what I had, in the bag. And she's like, no. She's like, take a dress. She's like, you have that striped dress, take that dress. I'm like, all right, so that's the dress I wore yesterday. And then she's like, I had chosen this outfit, and she's like, you're gonna wear flats? She's like, no. My mother is a dictum, you do not do presentations in flats. So I pulled out some heels, and she's like, no, not the brown ones. I was like, all right, fine. So I pulled out literally the fanciest heels I had. If you like my outfit, tell my mom. So anyway, so to be sure that my uncle was not in trouble from these beautiful ladies that he went out with, I would need to check their feet to make sure that one of them was not a cowhoof. The creepiest jumbie of all looks like a little kid. Now, this is not a cute jumbie. Most jumbies in illustrations are very cute. This happens to just be a really scary illustration of a jumbie. They are very scary, but they generally are depicted as these really sweet, cute little kids that you might just want to pick up. Because the Duen lures you in by making you feel sorry for it, and if that doesn't work, they lurk in the shadows outside your house at night, learn your name, and try to trick you to come outside. Growing up, I had to learn a lot of different ways to keep these jumbies at bay. If I came in after dark, I would turn around and walk in backward, because a jumbie can't follow you into your house if you're face to face. If I heard my name called at night, I never answered. I would say, "Is someone calling me?" and wait for somebody to confirm. If they didn't, I closed all the windows and pulled the covers up over my head, because it meant a jumbie was outside waiting for me. But jumbies weren't only talked about at night when the shadows seemed to move and the creepy factor was dialed up to max. People talked about them during the day, too, like they were regular people walking about with everybody else on the island. Unlike the fairy tales I loved in books, jumbies were living creatures that represented a real daily or nightly danger. But despite the fact that I was living among jumbies, I recognized that they were mostly just stories. Creepy, fun, magical stories. But none of the jumbies that thrilled me were in the books that I loved. I was 3 years old, as Sheila said, when I announced to my mother that I was going to grow up and be a writer. I had a huge, beautifully illustrated book of Grimm's fairy tales, and I thought, If these Rem boys could have a giant book with a name on it, me too. I probably did not say it like that, but I was pretty sassy at 3, so it's possible. I'm sure that a lack of Jumbie fairy tales was also a bit behind my desire to grow up and write. I was desperate to read about these creatures because when someone tells a story, it changes with the retelling. Some little detail is dropped or added. Maybe the victim starts out heading down the road in her blue church dress, and a few days later, it's a school day and she's wearing a green uniform. So as good as storytelling was, it was unreliable. And I liked the certainty of the page. I was all about the reread. My books got so worn that they often came apart at the binding. And my mother would take them to her office and have them recovered. This is actual, my husband actually sent this picture last night. This is one of my actual copies that I've had since I was like 2 or 3. So my mother worked at this courthouse, and there was actually a guy whose entire job was to bind those huge like leather tomes, like anytime there was like, whatever case came in and there was some new law or whatever, he would like put it all together and bind them. And so my mother would take my books to him when they got to this point and have him recover them. The problem was that when he recovered them, he recovered them with plain covers that looked like legal books. So I would hide my books from my mother so that she would not have them recovered because I would lose the beautiful covers. Crazy. I'm like, I would much rather have it just fall apart, which is what happens to a lot of them. I'm sorry to tell you. The other advantage of my books was that I could get these stories anytime I wanted. No waiting for someone to be in the mood to tell one of my favorites. Eventually, I started doing what all young writers do. I imitated the stories that I loved, and I embellished. Of course, at 3, embellishment was mainly restricted to drawing inside my books. This is one of the final illustrations in Aladdin. I don't know if you can see it. You can probably see the pencil marks, right? I drew pencil marks between all the mouths of the people. I think I was trying to figure out like who was talking to who. It seems like that was what or who like had a relationship with who. I think maybe those 2 girls over on the right were dating the boys on the left. I'm not really sure. I think, something about it. But you can see that the evil magician all the way on the right, I scratched his face out so hard that the indentations actually go through a couple of pages. I did not like that guy. But there was one thing not quite right about my books. Although my mother had been clearly careful to choose collections of stories that included cultures from all over the world, the stories themselves, at least the illustrations, weren't really that inclusive. Here's the Bamboo Princess. This is the cover, and that's inside that Purnell that I just showed you. Other than her clothing, you couldn't tell that she was Japanese. Here's Aladdin. He's supposed to be Middle Eastern, right? If you look Middle Eastern, all right. Here are some characters in a story called The Magic Treasure. They have names like Salim and Abdul and Judar, but you'll notice that they're all pretty pale. And Mother's eyes are actually blue. I don't know if you can see it here, but the Mother's eyes are blue. But in the same book, there were some characters who looked like me. It was in this illustration. The only people like me in my books were slaves. Granted, according to the story, some of the slaves were African slaves and some of them were Greek. But still, for a reflection of myself, this is all I was offered. I'm sure that as a child, I didn't really notice that none of the characters who looked like me, looked like me or anyone else I knew. That's the kind of thing that only occurs to you after you grow up and wonder why all of the characters that you write don't look like you. So is it any wonder that I was desperate for a story with creatures I liked and a hero who looked like me? Where were all the small brown girls with thick legs? That is me at 3 in my very first carnival costume. I was a red butterfly with gold dots, and my sneakers were gold. That's right. Obviously, I would have to take care of this myself. One of my first ever memories of critically evaluating a piece of literature happened when I was given 2 copies of Snow White. I loved the illustrations in one of them, and I loved the text in the other. One day, I decided to change the ending on the story with the better illustrations and the not-so-great text. I added something that clarified, at least for me, the crux of the story of Snow White. I added, and they fell in love. Thus began my career as an editor with an uncompromising taste and no fear of line edits, and a romance writer. Just a few years later, my romance writer career began in earnest when my father brought home a typewriter from work. It was an electric typewriter. It was shiny, and it smelled of office. You know that smell? It smells like air conditioning and ink and like unused reams of paper and like erasers and stuff. It smells great, right? So my father put this typewriter on the table and said, "Do not use it." So funny. It just so happened around the same time, I started to come home by myself. My brother had lacrosse practice or soccer practice or something like that. My mother had to stay with him to bring him back home after school. My father worked pretty far away, so I had nearly an hour to myself every day after school before anybody else come home to do whatever I wanted. I literally could have done whatever I wanted, guys. I chose to write a book. I found out that when you turn on a typewriter, it has this amazing, inviting little metallic hum. And when you press on the keys, they make this great sharp report sound. And when you put a sheet of paper in and you write on it, letters come out all crisp and sharp, and nothing like my handwritten scrawl. I have terrible handwriting. True story. My father has beautiful penmanship. My mother has beautiful penmanship. My brother has beautiful penmanship. I write like I was writing with my toes. It's pretty bad. So you can see the appeal of like pretty nice letters on a page. So my romance novel was about me and my best friend Alicia living in Manhattan skyscrapers with our husbands, and how since it was too cold for us to walk around the city, we took cars everywhere. Never mind that I was 12 years old and didn't know anything about writing a novel, or about romance, or about New York City. All of these things were minor details. The fact that I wrote about a place that I had never been to is a consequence, I think, of reading mostly stories that happen in other places. A friend of mine, Pamela Mordecai, who's a Jamaican writer, recently said that people from the Caribbean are always looking out because you can't look in. It's too small. And maybe that was true for me at the time. So I wrote about New York City. I was excited about this new story, so I told Alicia that I was writing a novel and that I was going to grow up and be an author. Other than making this declaration to my mother at age 3, I had told no one else. My best friend laughed at me and said, "But you're failing English class." It was true, I was. But I thought the story was what the writer took care of, and cleaning it up was the job of an editor. When I was finished with my story, determined to prove her wrong, I brought my 12-chapter, 2 pages per chapter novel to school for her to read. It turns out that saying you've written a romance novel and bringing it to school is not the kind of thing you can keep on your wraps. Pages got passed around, and eventually a teacher got hold of my novel. And despite the fact that this was a romance novel with hardly even a kiss in it, I went to a pretty conservative, all-girl Catholic school. So, at some point, I see that shaking. At some point, my parents were called, and my father read my romance novel. And then he checked the typewriter ribbon, which was when I found out that this particular kind of typewriter had ribbon where every letter type was punched out of it. So it was absolutely no problem at all to match up the words in my romance novel to the typewriter ribbon. I don't recall what kind of trouble I got into. I imagine at the time it probably felt pretty bad. But I'll tell you one thing. These days, my father is one of the first people to read my manuscripts. Since I had written my first novel at age 12, I felt pretty certain that I would have a career as a writer before I exited my teens. At age 15, I moved to Brooklyn, New York with my mother and my brother. My father stayed in Trinidad. And I thought, right, here we go. But it turned out that getting a book into the hands of someone who could put it into print was slightly more difficult than I had anticipated. I mean, I had stories. I had a huge red notebook full of them. How come nobody knew I had these stories? Plus, I had ideas I hadn't even written down yet. But no one came knocking on my door to talk to me about all of these great ideas. Where was my editor? Around that same time, I came across a story called The Friends by Rosa Guy. She was a Trinidadian author, and the girl in the story looked like me and had just moved to Brooklyn from the Caribbean like me. To be fair, I had read a lot of other books about Caribbean kids by Caribbean authors. Trinidad, and the Caribbean in general, is actually quite literary. We have V.S. Naipaul and Michael Anthony and Herbert Delisser and on. But I connected to The Friends in a way that made me want to write for children, effectively ending my career in romance. Eventually, I figured out that no editor or publisher was going to come knocking on my door, and I would have to send my stories to people. But I was sure that when editors got them, I would have the enviable task of deciding which of these lucky people got to read them. I mailed out my stories, and I waited. And eventually, an editor actually did call to talk to me about a picture book. I was in college at the time, and a friend of my mother's who was staying with us took the call, but did not think to take down the name of the editor, or the publishing house she had called from, or the phone number. I had sent out dozens of copies of the story. When I say dozens, I probably mean 100. Okay, all right. So I had no way of tracking down exactly who it might have been. If you're wondering whatever happened with that house guest, no one has seen her since. Sorry. Since I had missed my big authorial debut, I needed a job. I was in grad school by then, and I got a job as a kindergarten teacher assistant, and I realized something. Teachers only work from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. If I became a teacher, I would have entire afternoons. Plus, I would be spending my days with the very people I was writing for. I switched programs, got my M.Ed in elementary education, became a teacher, and had no time to write at all for the next 6 months. It turned out that teachers do not have all this time on their hands. And then summers just spent recovering. After 6 years teaching, I got married, and my husband very wisely pointed out that if I wanted to be a writer, I was going to have to leave teaching because, newsflash, you can't be a writer if you don't actually write anything. So I became an editor at an educational publishing company, the same kind of editor who I thought could fix anything that the writers sent in, because the writers only had to have the good ideas. Karma. But I did have time for more stories, and this time when I sent them out, my mailings were in small batches. Once I submitted a picture book manuscript to Lee and Love. They liked the story and they asked for revisions. I did not know that when someone asks you for revisions, you don't have to turn those around in 10 seconds. I thought that if you were asked to do something, you had better hurry up and do it quick, otherwise your opportunity would vanish. Having missed an opportunity before, I was certainly not going to let that happen again, so I slapped together a revision, which of course got rejected. I decided this whole submitting to publishers thing myself was not for me. I was going to get an agent. I was smart enough to work on that story some more before I started querying agents, a process that is quite possibly the third ring of hell. Why didn't all agents have uniform requirements? Why did one want only a query letter, and somebody else want 3 pages, and somebody else want just the synopsis? Why couldn't this industry get their crap together? I was certain that the querying process was secretly designed to kill any author's creativity and dissuade her from writing a story ever again. However, after a couple of months, I signed with an agency, and my shiny new agent started to send out my picture book manuscripts. I decided to write another novel. Since the whole romance novel fiasco, I had never been able to finish a longer piece. I really wanted to see if I could write a novel all the way through to the end. And because I had not intended for anyone to ever see this story, after all, I was going to be a picture book author, I was not concerned about what the story was going to be. So for the first time, I allowed myself to look in at my own island. And I found that, in fact, it was not too small. I worked on the commute to and from work, first writing longhand in a marble composition notebook. The top one is actually what I use for Angels With, the bottom one is what I use for the Jumbies. And then I converted my scribbles onto my laptop. I surprised myself and finished the entire manuscript, and I was starting to edit it when baby number 1 arrived on the scene. Just a couple of weeks after my daughter was born, I had a moment of panic that I hadn't talked to my agent in almost a year. So I sent her an email to check in with the first 2 chapters of the book I was working on. She called me a couple of days later and asked if I had anything else. What I had was a mess, so I told her no. Then she asked if I could give her a synopsis, which I did. A few days later, there was another call, which began with the words, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "I just had a baby." I'm always sitting down. And she told me she had sold my new novel to Simon & Schuster based on those 2 chapters in the synopsis, and how did I feel about that? To be honest, I have no recollection about how I reacted to that news. I guess I was happy, but I was holding a 3-week-old baby at the time, and the only thing I remember is that I was thinking I would have to write the rest of this novel in 3 months, because that was all the material I had. And I knew that once I returned to the office, it just would never happen. I started in October, and on New Year's Eve at midnight, I emailed my editor and my agent the final manuscript of Interest Race. This is not in my notes, but I just want to say that I had postpartum depression on top of all of that. So this was not a wise move on my part, not by a long shot. Unfortunately, I also didn't remember from my experience with Lee and Lowe that fast revisions are often terrible. The manuscript that I handed in was a bit of a disappointment. My agent called to say that she would not have given it to my editor if she had had the opportunity to read it first. But my editor seemed undaunted by the fact that my manuscript was literally a hot mess, and she and I worked on it together over the next 3 months or so until she felt it was in good shape. So the right editor really will take those great ideas and help you whip it into shape. I was lucky. I was very, very lucky. Once the book was finished, I decided to take a break and focus on my sweet little screaming child. About a year later, just before Angel's Grace went to print, my editor sent me the jacket copy to look over. It read that Tracey Baptiste lives in New Jersey with her family. It also said, she is at work on another book. Which was when I learned that I was supposed to be at work on another book. Well, I had already written a book. And I was too tired to remember how difficult it had been, so I figured it would be no problem at all to write a second one. Since nobody seemed to mind that Angel's Grace was set in Trinidad, that gave me encouragement to write the story that I had wanted to for so long. I wanted to write a story about Jumbies. In all the time I had been writing and submitting stories, I had also been collecting fairy tales and folk tales from all over the world. At that time, I started thinking about how I could put Jumbies into a story. There seemed to be this epidemic of Cinderella stories that were coming out. There was The Way Meat Loves Salt, which is a Cinderella story from the Jewish tradition, Yes Shan's Chinese Cinderella, Rough-Faced Girl, which was actually one of my favorites, an Algonquin Indian version of Cinderella, and there was even one from the Caribbean called Cendrillon. But I was unsatisfied. None of these had what I wanted in my own fairy tale. Then one day, when I was browsing in another bookstore, I came upon this book, Best Love Folk Tales of the World. It's a pretty thick anthology. So they actually had, it was sectioned off by different parts of the world, and they had a Caribbean section. But they didn't have any stories from Trinidad and Tobago. They did have stories from Jamaica and Haiti. I found this story called The Magic Orange Tree, which is a story from Haiti. And it was a Cinderella story. Only there was no prince and no ball, no fairy godmother either. There was a wicked stepmother and a sweet but abused little girl. And that girl had to get herself out of her predicament. She did it with a little magical help, but also by being clever and brave. I loved that girl. And I began to wonder if I could tell her story and add my own flavor to it. I wondered how Cinderella would fare if she had to come face to face with a jumbie. But as much as I wanted to tell the story, I found it really difficult. Then I realized that in writing my first novel, I had learned how to write that story. I had a PhD in writing Angel's Grace, but I had no idea how to write the Jumbies because it was completely different. And all the tools I had used on Angel's Grace were of little use to me now. I needed new tools. I needed to start from scratch. I needed to become an expert in writing the Jumbies. So I started over. I put the story away, and I came back to it. I wrote another novel, which didn't sell, and I came back to this one. I threw the story out, and I dug it back up again. I refused to look at it for months, sometimes years at a time, but I always came back to it because this little girl wanted a story, and she was not going to let it go until it was in her tiny, demanding hand. Unfortunately, even when I felt I had whipped it into good shape, this story, because it was so different from the first one I had written, didn't go over well with my editor or my agent. It turns out that a relationship with your agent is very much like a marriage. You can be great people separately, but if you don't make a good team, eventually things are going to fall apart. My husband encouraged me to move on. This was business after all, and I was in charge of my career as an author. It took a while, but I did. I want you to know that I parted on excellent terms with my agent, and she and I still talk, my former agent. As I continued to work, I began to wonder what I really wanted to say. All of the fairy tales I had read and loved said something beyond the story, things that I only noticed after I was all grown up. I decided I wanted to talk about being the other, about what it feels like when you are not at all like everyone around you, the way I felt when I first moved to Brooklyn and tried to navigate a culture that was completely unlike my own in Trinidad. I wanted to write about what it feels like to stay hidden and in your own corner, something I noticed I started doing when I was in rooms with mostly white students at college. I wanted to also talk about something that really bothers me in our culture and in our vocabulary, that the word dark equals bad. But I wondered if I could say something about a true horror, one that I had only read about in history books, but still echoed out all around me. I wondered if I could say something about slavery and colonialism. As I wrote, I kept adding layer after layer and digging deeper and deeper. I put it all on the page. I didn't hold back. I had learned that really there was no reason to hold back. With every book, I was going to have to start from scratch anyway. And I would have to relearn how to tell that particular story. So why not leave it all on the page every time? I learned that doing that is exhausting and frightening. but it doesn't matter. This is the service you pay to tell the story the best you can. I had a second child, again, by postpartum depression. In the manic desperation of the jumbie submarine, there's the desperation I felt in those first few days after having my son. A few years later, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And the fear of that shiver of unknown, made it on the page in the way that Corinne looks at her father when she doesn't know if she can bring him back from becoming a jumbie, the way my children looked at me when they weren't sure what was happening and what they could do to help. And eventually I found that I had earned my PhD in telling a story about a creature that felt colonized, that felt trapped and alone, that felt desperate. Well, what the story looks like, if you're not looking too closely, is a story of a brave girl who battles a fearsome creature and faces down horror with the help of her friends. In the process, I learned that there really are no shortcuts. But when you're done, if you've given it everything, if you've done it right, you've told a story that will speak to everyone. Whether they're a child in Trinidad who knows to turn around before she goes into her house at night, or a child in New York City who has never heard of a jumbie. Eventually, during this lengthy writing process, as I added all of these layers, I began to send the story out again to editors and to agents. I had some early encouraging remarks, but some felt I had more work to do, which I did. I've never been one to shy away from a religion. Others were dismissive, as happens in this industry, but a defining moment in the life of this particular book came when I had a face-to-face meeting with an editor, during which she said, and I quote, "Some books should just stay in the office drawer." Fortunately, I had learned that one person does not make or break your career, so respectfully, I disagreed. The comment only served to make me more determined. Maybe it's the Catholic schoolgirl in me, but failure was not an option, not with this story. I sent the story out one more time, and just a couple of months later, I had a shiny new agent who loved the story and understood what I was trying to say and wanted to be on my team. So she got ready to send the book out into the world, which was when I found out that it was hard. And I panicked. But things seem to have worked out okay. Since the Jumbies has been published, it has gotten a lot of attention, more than I could have imagined. I remember sitting in a marketing meeting for the book and telling my publisher that I was sure people from the Caribbean who had grown up with Jumbies would love it, and also little kids with Caribbean roots, expats. This, I thought, was my only audience. So the attention from a wide variety of people from everywhere was a real surprise. It was certainly more attention than my publishers had anticipated. And as I said, it's the reason I'm here talking to you guys today. People, non-Caribbean people, seem to be fascinated by Jumbies as I was when I was a kid. And because Jumbies are new in America, people see them as a fresh new idea, even though they've been around probably as long as any other fairy tale. So I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone asked me in an interview if I thought that Jumbies were ripe for the picking, if it was a new source of material that other writers could use with their stories. This idea gave me pause. That's not the right word. I felt literally sick at this question. I thought about myself as that little girl wishing that the stories I heard at bedtime could also be in the books that I loved. And I thought about all the years it took to wrangle this story onto the page. And I thought about the other story that I wanted to tell, the one about colonialism and taking things that belong to other people just because it's new to you. And I wondered if the interviewer read the book. No, Jumbies are not a new, untapped source waiting to be mined. Which is not to say that if you are genuinely interested in them, that you shouldn't explore these stories. But the people who will do that best are the ones who've either grown up with these stories or who are approaching it not as something to colonize, but as something to be a part of. There's been a lot of conversation lately about staying in your own lane. I've watched several of my writer friends express opinions that fall all along the wide range of this discussion. Some people are angry about it. Some are confused. Some find this idea restricting and frightening. I believe that if there are stories to be told about a culture, the majority of those stories should be told by the people of that culture. The majority, not all. An outside perspective can be just as interesting as an internal one, done correctly. And writers should not be suppressed when they want to express an idea. But the best stories come from a place of need. The way I needed to tell the story because I had wanted it for so long. I've been grateful for the attention that the Jumbies has gotten and the wide reach that it's enjoyed. And I want to see more stories like this that come from deep inside a culture, lots of different cultures. Because the more personal they are, the more universal they seem to be. I love the idea that readers can connect over things that reflect themselves, like I did with the Friends, and over things that are alien to them, as pale fairies in the snow were to me. The best part is that the stories that I don't write, because I can't write them all, right? I get to enjoy and support in my own way, just like you guys do when you blog and you do book talks, which is important, because stories that come out of great need like that are stories that I think we all need. I don't know if you want me to take questions. Or...
If you would like.
I don't mind.
Anybody have any questions? All right, I guess.
All right.
Thank you so much, Tracey.
Sure.